The first thing Commander Yale Dross noticed about the alien battle was how beautiful it was. She stood at the observation deck of the UES Relentless, the only human warship ever permitted into conclave space, and watched two civilizations try to kill each other with the elegance of a choreographed dance. The Virath Dominion's fleet hung in perfect formation on the left, 14 dreadnoughts, pale silver against the black, their energy lances firing in precise, staggered intervals like the fingers of a pianist. On the right, the Sakari Republic answered with equal grace. Their vessels, dark and angular, returned fire in patterns that Dross's tactical AI had already classified as ceremonial broadside rotation, Doctrine Variant 7. She had been watching for 4 hours. 17 ships had taken damage. None had been destroyed. "They're not shooting to kill," said Lieutenant Commander Priya Chen, appearing at her elbow with 2 cups of coffee substitute. "The real stuff had run out 3 weeks into the transit. Look at their targeting vectors. Every shot is aimed at shielded sections. They're just poking each other." "It's called demonstrating resolve," said Ambassador Kreeth of the Galactic Conclave, who had been standing quietly nearby and apparently had excellent hearing. He was tall, 7 feet of mottled gray and blue skin, with 4 eyes that each moved independently. He was what passed for a diplomat in this part of the galaxy, and he had spent the last 6 hours explaining the war to Dross with the patient tone of a professor whose students kept asking the wrong questions. "The Virath Dominion and the Sakari Republic have been at war for 63 years. They fight to demonstrate that they will not be dominated. Once sufficient resolve has been demonstrated, they withdraw. They rebuild. In 4 to 7 months, they fight again." "And this has been going on for 60 years, Dross said. 63, yes. And neither side has gained territory. That is not the point of the war." Dross looked at him steadily. "Then what is?" Kreeth blinked 2 of his 4 eyes, which she had learned meant something between surprise and discomfort. "Sovereignty, honor, the acknowledgement by one's enemy that one exists and cannot be erased." On the observation deck, the Virath formation executed a slow, graceful withdrawal. Both sides had taken cosmetic damage. 300 million credits of military hardware had exchanged fire for 4 hours. A total of 9 crew members across both fleets had died, she knew, because Kreeth had given her the numbers, almost proudly, as though the low casualty count proved something admirable. Dross thought about the wars in human history, about Verdun, about Stalingrad, about the Pacific campaigns where men bled for every 100 meters of jungle, about how humans had learned, through rivers of blood, that war was a fire that consumed the people who lit it, and that the only rational response was to extinguish it as fast as possible, by any means necessary. She thought about what her grandmother had told her, a woman who survived something that didn't have a polite name. The worst wars are the ones nobody tries to finish. Chen leaned close and lowered her voice. "Commander, permission to say something that might be outside my pay grade." "Always. They've turned war into a sport, complete with rules, seasons, and a score." Before Dross could answer, the communication console behind them chimed, a priority frequency conclave emergency band. The tactical display bloomed red. A Sakari colony fleet, 40 vessels carrying 700,000 civilians to a new settlement world, had been intercepted by a Virath strike group. Not in the engagement zone, not following doctrine. The colony fleet's distress signal was already cutting in and out. Kreeth stared at the display. For the first time in 6 hours, he looked uncertain. "This," he said quietly, "is not supposed to happen." Dross was already walking toward the command deck. "Chen, battle stations," quietly. "Ma'am, our orders are to observe." "We're observing," Dross said. "We're just going to observe from somewhere more useful." She didn't look back. Behind her, through the thick observation glass, the 2 alien fleets drifted apart like dancers at the end of a waltz, neither knowing yet that someone had just changed the music. The Sakari colony fleet lost 11 ships before the Virath strike group withdrew. 700,000 civilians, 11 ships. The distress calls had gone out, the nearby Virath vessels had turned away without engaging, and by the time Dross had the Relentless within range, the survivors were already gathering wreckage and body counts. She watched rescue operations from the bridge and felt something cold settle into her chest, not grief, not yet. Something older and more focused. The thing humans called reckoning. The conclave convened an emergency session 4 hours later. Dross attended as an observer, as she was required to do, and sat in the circular gallery above the main chamber floor as 36 alien species argued across 17 translation frequencies. She listened. She had always been better at listening than anyone gave her credit for. Ambassador Kreeth spoke for the Virath. His tone was apologetic, careful. The strike group had acted outside doctrine. The admiral who ordered the attack, one Primus Commander Veth, had exceeded his authority. The Dominion was prepared to offer formal censure and reparations equivalent to 12% of the colony fleet's assessed value. The Sekari representative, a small creature with feathered headcrests and eyes like polished copper, accepted this with a gravity that Dross recognized as political theater. She had seen enough diplomatic proceedings to know when two sides were haggling over the appearance of outrage. "They're going to let it go," Chen murmured from beside her, keeping her voice below the translation frequencies. "They can't escalate," Dross said. "Escalation means fighting outside the rules. Fighting outside the rules means admitting there are no rules, and if there are no rules, the war stops being manageable. So they keep the rules to keep the war. Welcome to 60 years of it." After the session, a message arrived on the Relentless's private frequency. It was brief, encrypted in Sekari diplomatic cipher, and it had been sent by someone who had no business contacting a human vessel. Dross spent 2 hours with her decryption officer before reading it in her quarters. It was from General Osith, a senior Sekari commander who, according to every briefing she'd been given, was a moderate, one of the faction within the Republic that had been quietly arguing for a negotiated end to the war for the past 12 years. His message was not a diplomatic communique. It was something between a confession and a warning. The faction controlling the Virath strike group was not rogue in the way Kreeth had described. They were organized. They had backing from at least 3 Sekari High Council members. They believed the Conclave's rules had kept the Republic from winning a war it should have ended decades ago. They were preparing to escalate in a way that could not be smoothed over by reparations percentages. Their next target, Osith wrote, was a Virath core world, Calith 3, population 340 million. Dross sat with that number for a long time. She had learned to sit with numbers until they became real, until they stopped being data and started being people. 340 million was about the population of the United States at the time of her great-grandmother's birth. She thought about every city, every school, every ordinary Tuesday that number represented. Then she contacted Earth Command. The response came in 6 hours, which meant someone senior had been woken up. The reply was clear, firm, and completely useless. The Relentless was to maintain observer status. Humanity could not afford to antagonize either the Virath or the Sekari. The Conclave invitation had been a diplomatic milestone. There were protocols. There were channels. The appropriate channels would be engaged. Dross sent a reply that she worded very carefully. Acknowledged. Relentless is repositioning to improve observation capability. All actions will be consistent with our mission. She was technically not lying. She was going to observe the battle for Calith 3 very closely. She went to the bridge. Navigation, plot a course for Calith 3, best speed. The navigator looked up. "Commander, that'll put us in Virath territory." "I know where it'll put us." Dross looked at the star chart. "Chen, what's our readiness status?" 78%. We took micro damage on the hull transition. I can get you 86 in 4 hours. You have 3. She did not tell her crew what was coming. She didn't need to. They were the crew of the Relentless, hand-selected from the sharpest minds in the Earth Defense Fleet, engineers who could fix anything, gunners who could thread a needle at 30,000 kilometers, Marines who had trained in every conceivable hostile environment. They read her posture and her tone the way sailors read weather. They began preparing without being told to. The stars streaked past as the Relentless jumped. Behind them, in the conclave chamber, no one had noticed they were gone. The Sakari Armada came out of faster-than-light travel in a standard assault Diamond 44 vessels, ranging from light destroyers to 3 full dreadnoughts, exactly the kind of overwhelming force that historically convinced a Virath world to suffer visible damage and then request conclave mediation. It was a message, not an attack. A very loud, very well-armed message. And then the UES Relentless was between them and Caliph 3. The Armada's lead vessel, the command dreadnought Immortal Doctrine, bearing the battle scars of 9 engagements and the personal flag of Admiral Veth himself, decelerated and stopped. Through 44 targeting systems, the alien crews looked at the human ship and processed what they saw. The Relentless was not what they expected. Humanity's early warships had been clumsy by galactic standards, boxy construction platforms fitted with guns, still figuring out the physics of interstellar propulsion. The Conclave's files on human vessels were 8 years old. They showed a spacefaring species in its infancy, still impressed with its own technology. But the Relentless was a different class entirely. She was 1,400 meters long, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the shape of her, not the long, elegant dagger profile of Sakari vessels, not the wide ceremonial broadside mass of Virath dreadnoughts. She was angular and brutish, all hard angles and recessed systems, her hull a composite material that Sakari sensor arrays couldn't fully classify. She had no visible energy lance arrays. She had no broadside cannon configurations. What she had, bristling from her flanks in clusters that defied immediate categorization, was a series of launchers, railgun spines, and close-range defense networks that her designers had clearly arranged not for elegance but for coverage. The ability to hit anything, at any angle, at almost any range. She looked, as Veth's tactical officer would later note in his report, like a creature that expected to be surrounded. Admiral Veth opened a channel. His translator rendered his words into flat, mechanical standard. Human vessel, you are in a conflict zone. You have no standing here. Withdraw immediately and you will not be treated as a combatant. Commander Dross appeared on the channel. She was a lean, dark-eyed woman who looked too calm for someone standing between a warfleet and its target. Admiral, I'm not blocking your path. I'm between you and 340 million people who have nothing to do with your war. There's a difference. Veth studied her. In Sakari tactical doctrine, a lone vessel intercepting an armada was either a suicidal decoy or a critical communications relay for a larger force. His long-range sensors showed no other vessels in the system. He recalculated. You are one ship. I'm aware of that. This armada has 44 vessels, 3 Tier 1 dreadnoughts. You cannot stop us. I'm not going to stop you, Dross said. I'm going to give you 60 seconds to decide to stop yourself. Because once this goes further, nothing that happens here gets put back the way it was. The channel closed. Veth looked at his tactical officer, who was still trying to classify the Relentless's weapon configurations. 60 seconds, Veth said, more to himself than to anyone. He had been in 9 battles. He had never been addressed like this. Something in his chest, not fear, the Sakari did not fear, but something adjacent to it stirred and was suppressed. He waited 50 seconds out of something he would never have admitted was curiosity. Then he ordered the salvo. 44 vessels fired simultaneously. It was the kind of salvo that ended conversations, a wall of energy, mass driver rounds and plasma bolts that would have vaporized any single vessel in known galactic space. The targeting computers had precise locks. The gunnery crews, veterans all, did not miss. The salvo hit the Relentless full-on. For 3 seconds, the human ship vanished inside a storm of fire and light. Then the storm cleared. She was still there. Damaged sensor readers on the Immortal Doctrine flickered with heat blooms and hull ruptures across the Relentless's port quarter, but still there, still in one piece, still between the Armada and Caliph 3. In the Sakari fleet's communication channels, for one full second, there was complete silence. Then the Relentless began to move. Not backward, not in a retreat vector, not in a distress spiral. She accelerated, directly at the Armada. Veth stared at his tactical display as the human ship closed the distance, and he felt something he had never felt in 9 battles. He did not know what came next. Every battle of his career had followed a shape he understood. The shape of this one had just become unrecognizable. "Evasive," he said, and then more quietly to no one, "What are you doing?" On the bridge of the Relentless, through a haze of smoke and alert klaxons and sparking panels, Dross gripped her command chair and watched the Armada grow large on the viewscreen. "We have a hull breach on decks 14 through 16, Chen reported. 17 crew in that section. Get them out full ahead." Dross's voice was steady. "Gunnery, targeting priority is propulsion systems, then weapons clusters, then comms. We don't destroy unless we have to. We make them unable to continue." "Ma'am, at this range." "That's why we're going to this range." She looked at the incoming fleet. "They've never fought someone who comes toward them. Let's find out what that does to their doctrine." The Relentless hit the Sakari formation like a knife, pushed into a hornet's nest. And everything that followed broke every rule of war that had held for 63 years. The first thing that went wrong for the Sakari was the range. Every engagement doctrine in their naval history had been built around one fundamental truth. Ships fought at distance, where fire could be aimed, assessed, and responded to in a measured sequence. You fired. You absorbed fire. You withdrew to evaluate. The entire structure of Sakari tactical thinking rested on the assumption that both sides would maintain a respectful, survivable distance from which to conduct their killing. The Relentless was now inside that distance. Not marginally inside it, deeply, catastrophically inside it, threading through the formation at a range where Sakari vessels' targeting systems, designed for long-range precision, could barely track something moving at such oblique angles between their own hulls. 3 destroyers attempted to bring their main armaments to bear and found themselves pointing at each other. The Immortal Doctrine herself fired a secondary battery and missed the Relentless by 12 meters, the plasma bolt continuing on to clip the aft section of a Sakari escort cruiser. The Relentless, meanwhile, was not firing blindly. She was firing surgically. Railgun rounds from her port spine hammered the engine cluster of the destroyer Resolute Certainty, not destroying it, but shearing the primary drive manifold, leaving it drifting. A pair of point defense clusters on her starboard flank pivoted and punched out the communications array of the cruiser-honored doctrine before it could relay a targeting solution to the fleet net. Precision work. Methodical. The kind of targeting that required either extremely good computers or extremely good gunners under pressure, and the Relentless had both. Sergeant Kofi Mensah, lead gunner at Station 3, was bleeding from a scalp cut where a sparking panel had caught him. He had applied pressure with one hand and kept firing with the other. His station had shot out 2 sensor dishes, 1 weapons cluster, and a fuel line junction on 3 separate vessels in the last 4 minutes, and he was now talking his targeting computer through a firing solution that would require threading around through the gap between 2 Sakari ships at a combined closing speed of 12 kilometers per second. "You are not going to make that shot," said the ensign beside him. "You're not going to watch," Mensah said and fired. The round found the junction. The destroyer clarity of purpose went dark from the waist forward. Admiral Veth was shouting now, which was extraordinary, because Sakari officers were trained from adolescence to maintain vocal control in battle. He was shouting because his formation had dissolved. The diamond pattern that had kept his ships in disciplined, mutually supporting positions for the transit from Sakari space, was now a scattered mass of individual vessels all trying to independently track and engage a target that refused to stop moving in predictable directions. 3 of his ships had been hit by friendly fire. The Relentless had been struck 17 times in the last 9 minutes and was still operational, still moving, still cutting lateral gashes through his formation like something that had accepted its own damage as a running cost. "This is not a battle," his tactical officer said, with a kind of hollow bewilderment. "This is I don't have a word for this." "They're inside our response cycle," Veth said, with the tone of a man who had just understood something he didn't want to understand. "Every time we generate a targeting solution, they've moved. They're not reacting to us. They're making us react to them." He issued the withdrawal order. By doctrine, the Relentless should stop. A withdrawing force was never pursued. It was one of the oldest, most fundamental rules of engagement between civilized species. Pursuit made wars unmanageable, unpredictable. Pursuit was what you did when you wanted to annihilate rather than demonstrate. The Relentless pursued. She came after his withdrawing fleet with her engines at full capacity, targeting the slower vessels, the ones limping on damaged drives. The Sakari ships that could jump to FTL did so immediately. The ones that couldn't became priority targets, stripped of weapons and propulsion by those infuriating precise railgun bursts, left dead in space but intact, their crews alive and furious and helpless. Dross watched the armada disintegrate and felt no triumph. She felt the ship around her bleeding, the smell of burned circuiting in the air, the vibration of emergency bulkhead seals. The names Chen was reading from casualty reports that Dross filed away to think about later when there was a later. The Relentless had taken real damage. 2 decks open to space, sealed with emergency foam. An engine at 60%. The medical bay was operating at capacity. And then the cruiser Honored Vigilance made its choice. Its captain, watching his escape vectors close off as the Relentless systematically disabled the vessels around him, made the calculation that had never, in 63 years of Sakari-Virath war, ever been made. He pointed his ship directly at the Relentless and went to ramming speed. "Collision alert," Chen's voice went sharp. Dross looked at the trajectory on her screen, looked at the angles, saw something the Sakari captain had not seen. Port thrusters now, hard to port, match his angle. "That'll will clip." "Do it." The Relentless rolled into the collision vector instead of away from it, and the impact, when it came, was a scraping, shuddering groan of 2 hulls making contact at an oblique angle rather than a direct strike. The cruiser's bow crumpled against the Relentless's reinforced secondary hull. The Relentless spun out and away, and by the time she stabilized, the cruiser was tumbling, her ramming run converted by the angle into a glancing blow that left both ships damaged but intact. Dross gripped the arm of her command chair and breathed. "Nice flying," she told navigation. "I need a new change of clothes," the navigator replied. Dross almost smiled. She checked the tactical display. The armada was broken. 16 vessels destroyed, 22 disabled, 6 had jumped to FTL. The Relentless floated in a field of drifting wreckage between a broken fleet and a planet of 340 million people who would never know how close it had been. On Calith 3 orbital station, a Virath observation officer had been watching the entire engagement on long-range sensors. He had recorded everything. He had not said a single word in 47 minutes. He sat in his chair and looked at his display screen and tried to find the military concept that described what he had just watched. He could not find one because there wasn't one. Not in any language he spoke. For 11 hours after the battle, the Conclave's emergency channel was silent. This was unprecedented. The Conclave's emergency channel had never been silent for more than 20 minutes in its 400-year history. Disputes, crises, territorial incursions, they all generated immediate traffic, carefully worded communiques, formal protests, procedural motions filed in triplicate. The channel existed to channel. It was named for its function. And for 11 hours after the destruction of the Sakari Armada at Calith 3, it produced nothing but carrier hiss. Dross spent those 11 hours doing what she always did after a fight. She took care of her ship and her crew. She walked the damaged sections personally. Deck 14 was still partly open to space, sealed with emergency polymer that had set in pale orange foam layers, and the section smelled of ozone and the particular cold that came from bulkheads that had been exposed to vacuum. She walked through it slowly, reading the names of the dead from Chen's report, 17 names. She said each one aloud, to no one in particular, in the order they had been listed. It was not a procedure from the handbook. It was something her first commanding officer had done after their first engagement, and she had thought it was theater until she had understood that it was the opposite. It was a refusal to treat numbers as numbers. She was on the third name when she realized she was not alone. Standing at the far end of the sealed corridor, in a Virath environment suit that had been adapted for the breach conditions, was the conclave observer who had been attached to the Relentless since their arrival, a junior diplomatic attaché named Sarath who had spent most of the voyage being politely dismissive of human customs. He was watching her. She finished all 17 names. "What were you doing?" he asked. "Remembering them." "You knew them." "I knew their names. Now I'll know them better." She turned and walked back toward the command section. "You can report that to whoever sent you." He fell into step beside her. "No one sent me. I came because I didn't know what else to do." A pause. "Admiral Karath of the Virath Dominion is requesting to board your vessel." She looked at him sideways. "Why?" "Because he watched the battle." Sarath's 4 eyes moved in what she had learned was a Virath expression of uncertainty. "He watched the entire engagement and then spent 4 hours not speaking, that is not Karath. Karath is not a man who stops speaking." Dross granted the request. Admiral Karath was 70 years old by his species reckoning, a decorated commander who had fought in 30 Dominion engagements over 5 decades. He came aboard the Relentless with 2 aides, stood in the docking bay, and looked around at the damaged interior with an expression she couldn't read. He said nothing for almost 3 minutes. "Your ship looks like it was inside a star," he finally said. "Feels like it too, sir," said Ensign Taraka from the repair crew, who had not been told not to talk to the visitors. Dross didn't correct her. Karath spent 2 hours aboard. She showed him what she would show any official visitor: the bridge, the medical bay, the engineering section where her crew was working double shifts to restore full capability. He watched people working under conditions that would have qualified as medical emergencies on most galactic vessels. He watched a damage control team seal a secondary coolant rupture while the primary fix was still ongoing. He watched the cook serving meals to crew members who hadn't left their stations in 14 hours. "They are afraid," he said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "Most of them, yes," Dross said. "They do not act afraid. They're busy. Busy is better than afraid. You can do more with it." She poured him the Virath-appropriate beverage her protocol's officer had prepared, a pale blue liquid that smelled like old copper and apparently tasted excellent to species with 4-part olfactory systems. "What did you want to see, Admiral?" "I wanted to see if you were real," he said. He was quiet for a moment, turning the cup in large, deliberate hands. "We have observed humanity for 11 years. Your species was considered not unseriously but not urgently. You were new, still learning your own sky." He looked at her. "What your ship did at Calith 3 was not in our models." "I know." "How did you know to come?" "Someone told me." He waited for more. She didn't offer it. He accepted this with a small inclination of his head that her protocol files said meant respect for a boundary. Before he left, he stood in the docking bay again and looked at the damaged hull sections, the working crews, the operational efficiency of a warship that should by any metric be in a repair dock. He looked at it for a long time. "I have fought 30 battles," he said. "I have never been frightened during a battle. I have been frightened watching a recording of yours." He met her eyes. "Not frightened of you, frightened of the question I couldn't stop asking." "Which question?" He looked at the wall of the ship. "What else don't we know?" He left. Dross stood in the empty bay and felt the weight of the next week settling onto her. Earth Command had sent 2 messages in the last 3 hours, one threatening a court-martial, one suggesting a promotion. Neither surprised her. Osith had sent a single line, "You changed something. I still don't know what, but I felt it move." She thought about Kareth's question, "What else don't we know?" The answer, she suspected, was going to take a long time to answer properly. But for the first time since arriving in Conclave space, she had the feeling that someone was finally ready to ask it. On the Conclave channel, a transmission came through. Then another. Then 17 in rapid succession as 60 years of silence about a 60-year war started, piece by piece, to break. The mess hall of the Relentless had been through better days. 2 of the food processors were offline. 3 tables had been structurally compromised by the collision impact, and the overhead lights flickered every 11 minutes because an engineer named Kapoor had it on her list but hadn't reached it yet. Admiral Kareth sat across from Dross in this damaged room, with a cup of copper-smelling beverage, and a silence between them that felt like the beginning of something important. "Ask it," Dross said. Kareth set his cup down. "What does victory look like, for a human? When you fight a war, what are you trying to achieve?" She had expected a harder question. "We're trying to end it." He considered this. "All wars end, eventually." "No, I mean we're trying to end it on purpose, fast, completely. We go into a war thinking about the peace we want afterward and we fight backward from that." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "We didn't always do it that way. We had wars that lasted generations, wars that became their own reasons, fought because they had always been fought. People who were born into a war and died in it, and their children were born into it, and that was just what was." She paused. "We lost a lot of people learning that this was the wrong way to do it." "How many?" "Too many to give you a number that would mean anything." Kareth was quiet. "The war with the Sekari has lasted 63 years. My father's war. Before his, my grandfather's. They called it the Long Statement. The statement of the Dominion's right to exist in its own space, to not be dominated, to not surrender the sovereignty we developed over 5,000 years of civilization." "I understand that. Those things matter." She leaned forward. "But here's the question I keep asking. When does the statement end? When is it finished? What does the Sekari say back to you that tells you the statement is complete?" He opened his mouth and then closed it. She watched him. "You don't have an answer, because the war was never built with an answer. It was built to continue. It was built to maintain the balance of." "Admiral," her voice was gentle but direct, "I've read the diplomatic records. I've read 60 years of them. The balance has shifted 4 times in the last 30 years. The Dominion has been in the stronger position twice. The Republic twice. Both times, the side with the advantage could have pressed it into something decisive. Neither did, because decisive ends the war. And ending the war means figuring out what comes after. And nobody in 63 years has built a plan for what comes after." He was still. The flickering light passed over him twice. "You're saying we chose to continue." "I'm saying the system chose to continue and nobody stopped it." She sat back. "Humans do something after wars that probably sounds incomprehensible to you. We rebuild what we destroyed. Sometimes we rebuild our enemies. We've given money, expertise, infrastructure to nations we fought. Not because we're noble, we're not noble. We're practical. An enemy that has enough food and functioning roads stops being an enemy. That costs less than fighting them again." Kareth stared at her. "You help them. We end the war, all the way to the end, so we don't have to do it again." Outside the mess hall, in the corridor, General Osith of the Sekari Republic, officially listed as a prisoner of the engagement, his diplomatic shuttle captured intact during the battle, was sitting on a supply crate with a communication earpiece he had borrowed from one of the guards. He had not been authorized to listen to this conversation. He listened to it anyway, word by word, with the careful attention of a man hearing something he'd been waiting his whole career for someone to say. The next 30 minutes went through the history of human warfare in compressed, brutal clarity. The wars humanity had fought in the old centuries, grinding meat grinder campaigns that consumed entire generations. The wars humans had chosen to fight even when they could have avoided them, and the reasons behind those choices. The wars they had ended, not by destroying their enemies, but by making destruction unnecessary. Kareth asked questions she had never been asked before, because no species had ever sat across from a human military commander and tried to understand war from the inside out. He asked about unconditional surrender and what made it different from humiliation. He asked about Reconstruction and whether it generated resentment. He asked about the Marshall Plan, which required 15 minutes of historical context, and left him silent for almost as long afterward. "You destroyed their capacity to make war," he said at last, "not their capacity to exist." "Yes. And then you helped them build back, but built without the machinery of war." "More or less." "That is," he started again. "We have no concept for this. We have victory, which means the enemy acknowledges dominance. We have defeat, which means we acknowledge theirs. We have the long statement, which means neither. But what you're describing is," he searched his vocabulary, "a third thing, an architecture, a deliberate construction of a world in which the fighting cannot restart." "We call it a peace settlement," Dross said. "We've had bad ones and good ones. The bad ones created the conditions for the next war. The good ones created 60, 80 years without another war, sometimes more. And you believe this is possible here?" "I believe 63 years of the same war with no plan to end it is a machinery that will keep running until it runs out of people to consume." She looked at him levelly. "Your faction, Osith's faction, the people in both governments who want this to stop, they're not weak. They're the only sane ones in the room. They just need someone to show them what stopping actually looks like." From the corridor on the borrowed earpiece, Osith closed his eyes. He opened a private frequency to his faction contact on the Sakari Peace Council. He had 6 words: "I know what to offer them." The long statement, after 63 years, had just heard a possible ending. Admiral Veth had survived the battle at Caliph 3 with his ship, his pride, and very little else. The Immortal Doctrine had jumped to FTL with a damaged primary hull and 41 crew casualties, the highest single engagement losses Veth had taken in a 12-year career. He had filed his report, absorbed his censure from the Sakari High Command with the expressionless rigidity of a man who had decided to treat humiliation as ammunition, and had spent the following 72 hours doing 2 things: studying every piece of sensor data from the Caliph 3 engagement that existed, and making contact with the other 4 admirals who shared his conviction that the Conclave's peacetime politics was about to hand the Republic a historic defeat. The rogue faction, which had never named itself, which operated through indirect channels and deliberate ambiguity, had reached a decision point. The peace faction's quiet negotiations, whatever they were producing, would close off the window for escalation. Osith was somewhere in Conclave space, and the rumors said he was talking to the humans. The Sakari High Command was wavering. If the peace faction delivered something concrete, the war would end on terms that the rogue faction considered a surrender in slow motion. The Conclave Station was the key. It was the largest neutral structure in the region, hosting the emergency negotiations that had been opened in the wake of Caliph 3. If the Conclave Station was damaged, not destroyed, damaged, the negotiations would collapse. The moderate faction would be blamed for security failures, and the rogue admirals would have their justification for a full military operation that bypassed the diplomatic process entirely. 3 Tier 1 dreadnoughts, Veth's Immortal Doctrine and 2 sister ships, ostensibly a routine patrol. The Conclave Station had no military force. The Virath fleet was on the wrong side of the system, 30 minutes away at best speed, and the Relentless, according to the last public disposition filing, was in Conclave drydock receiving emergency repairs. She just wasn't finished. Dross was in the middle of an argument with the dock superintendent about her timeline when Chen appeared in the doorway with the look she got when she had information nobody wanted. 3 Sakari dreadnoughts, inbound, 40 minutes out. Whose registry? Immortal Doctrine's flag, it's Veth. Dross turned back to the superintendent. How many engines do I have? 3 of 4, but the 4th. 3 is enough. She was already moving. Get my crew back aboard now. The Relentless undocked on 3 engines, and a prayer at a repair state her insurance classification would have called catastrophically incomplete, with a crew recalled from meals, sleep, and at least 3 ongoing personal conversations that were never properly finished. She moved out into the space between the Conclave station and the incoming threat, and the second time in the same week, she was one ship between something large and something that couldn't afford to be destroyed. But this time was different. She had 72 hours of data on Veth. She had studied his engagements, his timing, his doctrine, and she had something the open void of Caliph 3 had not offered: geometry. The Conclave station was massive, a ring structure 3 kilometers across, studded with docking pylons, fuel terminals, communications arrays, and service corridors that Dross had spent the last 48 hours memorizing. It was not a military installation. It was, however, a battlefield if you knew how to make it one. She positioned the Relentless at the station's primary approach vector, then immediately moved, not backward, lateral, threading between 2 of the station's outer pylons, using their bulk as cover while placing the Relentless in a position where any attack on her would require the Sekari to fire through or around station infrastructure. Veth had 3 dreadnoughts. Dreadnoughts fought in open space. They were not built for geometry. Veth arrived and read the situation in approximately 30 seconds. She's inside the station frame, his tactical officer reported. I can see that. Our firing solutions will require. The pylons are in our trajectories on 7 of 8 attack vectors. The 8th would require us to pass through the service debris field from the Caliph 3 relief operations. Micro impacts at dreadnought approach speeds would be navigable. Risky. Veth said nothing. He was studying the long-range sensors showing the Relentless's position, and he was thinking about that recording he had watched 40 times. The way she moved. The way her captain had turned into a ram rather than away from it. He was building a model of the human commander in his mind, and the model kept coming back to the same conclusion. She was not guarding the station. She was using the station. She wants us in that debris field, he said. Yes. In a debris field at close quarters, we lose the advantage of our weight-range doctrine. He took a breath. She's done this before. Veth opened a channel, not to the station, to the Relentless directly. Commander Dross. A beat of silence, then Admiral. You are on a damaged vessel. We have 3 dreadnoughts. The outcome of this engagement is statistically not in question. I know the statistics, Dross said. I've never found them very reassuring. I am giving you the option to stand down. Withdraw from the station approaches. Allow us to conduct our operation. You will not be targeted. I appreciate the offer. Her voice was completely even. No. Then you understand what? Admiral, a shift in her tone, still calm, but something underneath it that was not calm at all. The Conclave is watching. Every diplomatic species with an observer on that station is recording this on 7 different sensor arrays. Your operation was supposed to happen before anyone knew what it was. It didn't. She let that settle. If you fire on this station, in full view of the Conclave, with negotiations ongoing, you will not create a justification for escalation. You will create a war crimes tribunal, and your faction will have handed the Peace Council everything they need to end your careers and close your war in the same motion. There was a long silence on the channel. She's right, Veth's tactical officer said very quietly. Veth stared at the display showing the Conclave station, the battered human ship tucked into the station's infrastructure, and the 13 observer vessels that had quietly maneuvered to better recording positions over the last 30 minutes. He stared at it until the tactical picture resolved into the shape it had always been. Not a battle, a political trap, and the human commander had seen it before he had. Behind him, on the secondary comms board, he could see the peace faction's representatives already transmitting, not to him, but to Sakari High Command. The recordings were already in transit. The tribunal language was already being drafted. "Stand down," he said. The word cost him something. He wasn't sure yet what it was. He thought it might be the war. The immortal doctrine held position. The other two dreadnoughts followed. And in the space between three dreadnoughts and a battered, beautiful, impossible ship, a different kind of silence settled, not the silence of hesitation, but the silence of a thing that had stopped. The Relentless went into dry dock for real this time. She came in on 3 engines with a list to port, and a hull that the dock crews took one look at and went very quiet about. She had 2 engine sections requiring full replacement, 3 decks that needed structural reconstruction, a weapons cluster that had fused into a single unworkable mass, and a crew that filed off the gangways with the deliberate, heavy movements of people who had spent too long using adrenaline as a substitute for sleep. The dock superintendent who had argued with Dross about the repair timeline 2 days ago met her at the airlock and said nothing. He just stepped aside and let her pass. Earth Command's response arrived 14 hours later. It was 3 pages long and had been signed by 6 different admirals and 2 government ministers. The first page was a formal reprimand for unauthorized combat operations in conclave space. The second page was a preliminary commendation for decisive action in defense of civilian infrastructure. The third page requested her immediate presence at a strategic briefing that was, the message noted with considerable understatement, time-sensitive. Dross read all 3 pages, set the document down, and went to the memorial wall that her crew had put together in the corridor outside medical. 17 photographs. She stood in front of them for 20 minutes. Chen found her there. The conclave is convening a full session. Both sides are sending delegations. They're asking if you'll attend not as an observer, as a presenting party. What do I have to present? They want to hear what you said in the mess hall, the thing about rebuilding, the thing about war having an architecture. Chen leaned against the wall. Word got out. Osith's people leaked it. It's been translated into 11 languages. Kareth gave an interview where he said he'd heard something that changed how he understood his own civilization's history. She paused. You started something. I started several things, Dross said. I'm still hoping the court-martial one doesn't catch up. In the conclave chamber, 3 days later, Commander Yale Dross of the United Earth ship Relentless stood before a gathering of 31 species and gave 40 minutes of testimony that her communications officer later estimated was viewed by more sentient beings than any single broadcast in human history. She did not present it as a lecture. She talked about human history the way her grandmother had talked about the neighborhood she grew up in directly, without romance, with a clear accounting of the bad alongside the good. The wars that failed, the pieces that held, the difference between them and why that difference mattered. Osith sat in the Sakari delegation box and watched her. He had been formally reinstated by the peace faction following Veth's public humiliation, which the recordings had made thorough. He was, by a chain of events nobody had quite planned, the most influential Sakari military voice in the peace negotiation. A general who had quietly worked for an end to the war for 12 years, who had taken the risk of contacting a human commander in an act of desperation, and who had found himself, improbably, on the right side of history at the right moment. Admiral Kareth sat in the Vireth delegation box and watched her too. When she finished, he was the first person in the chamber to stand. 30 other species, one by one, followed. Dross didn't know what to do with that, so she went back to her seat and waited. The formal negotiations took 11 weeks. She wasn't present for most of them. Those were for diplomats, and she was, first and last, a commander. But she was consulted repeatedly on the section of the agreement that neither side had a template for, what reconstruction looked like, what it meant to help an adversary rebuild without humiliating them, what sovereignty meant when both sides acknowledged it. The drafters called this section the Dross Provisions. which she found mortifying and which she was informed by multiple parties was not negotiable. The treaty was signed in the conclave chamber on a Thursday, with 31 witness species, and a human delegation that had grown over 11 weeks from a single battleship's crew to a full diplomatic mission. The long statement, 63 years of demonstration and counter-demonstration and dead crew members and damaged worlds, ended with 2 signatures and a provision for joint infrastructure development that would put Virath engineers on Sekari colony worlds and Sekari agricultural specialists on Virath reclamation projects within 6 months. It was not a perfect peace. Dross knew better than to expect a perfect peace. It was a structure, an architecture, as Kareth had called it, and structures required maintenance and repair, and the occasional emergency intervention from people who cared whether they stood. Humanity, the conclave formally noted, had demonstrated both the capability and the inclination to provide that service. On the morning the Relentless was cleared to depart, Dross walked the length of the ship one more time. The new hull sections were brighter than the old ones, not yet worn into the same dark gray. She ran her hand along a bulkhead seam where 2 repair teams' work met and didn't quite match, the visible line of it like a scar that had healed crooked and strong. Outside the dry dock, she could see the departure corridor that had formed without anyone ordering it. Virath patrol ships on the port side, Sekari escort vessels on starboard, arranged facing each other across the Relentless's departure vector, not in opposition but in something that had no name in either military tradition. A witness formation, her protocol officer suggested, acknowledging passage. Osith's voice came over the open channel, brief and quiet. "Safe travels, Commander." Kareth, a moment later, "The question you answered will keep being asked. Thank you for not leaving it unspoken." Dross sat in the command chair of a ship that looked like it had been argued with by the universe and had argued back, surrounded by a crew that had 17 empty seats and enough shared experience to fill a book. None of them were ready to write yet. "Navigation," she said. "Ready, Commander." She looked at the corridor of alien vessels and the stars beyond them and the long way home. "Take us out, slow and visible. Let them see us leave." The Relentless moved forward, and every vessel in the corridor held position and held silence as she passed, a thing that had entered this part of the galaxy as an observer and was leaving it as something else entirely, something the galaxy did not yet have a word for, though it would. It would find one.